All right. Well, we're on the clock here by about 3 minutes. We do have several people in, so I'm going to go ahead and just go ahead and get us started, and then we'll add people as they come on board. So welcome to Kodiak Trust webinar for the month of April. We're glad to have you with us today. The presentation today by Daen Wombwell will be of great interest to those who are using insurance, premium financing. I'm Jeff Wright from Kodiak Trust Company, based here in Alaska. Alaska is one of the premier states for trusts, primarily for reasons that the state very early on actually was one of the first adopters of changing trust law in order to meet the needs of trusts, both domestically in the United States and internationally. They did several things with their legislation early on and are recognized as the best state for asset protection. But beyond that, it's a legislation that is very flexible for bringing trusts into the state. The rules on forming or changing situs into the state of Alaska are very flexible. Pour-over rules are very flexible here in Alaska, and there's a lot of very positive things about the state. We call it the quiet state because we don't tend to promote ourselves in the way that Nevada and South Dakota do. They tend to be very loud, which we prefer not to do. We prefer to be good and solid and yet not proclaiming, hey, come to the new tax haven of the world, which is what Nevada was doing for quite a while. Kodiak Trust Company itself has been in existence since 2017. We specialize in both domestic as well as international trusts. One of the things which we have taken on, which few trust companies do, surprisingly, is we do insurance. We hold insurance trusts as trustees, as well as holding insurance policies within trusts where the trust is the beneficiary. We have a lot of expertise in Latin America, and with our fluency and knowledge of culture and values down in Latin America, we're able to support a lot of Latin American clients. Today's speaker, Daen Wombwell, is from the UK, and he has, besides working in the military in his younger days, I would assume, he is the co-founder and CEO of NIW, which if you are not in the insurance field, you wouldn't know, but anybody in the insurance field would consider NIW the premier provider of premium financing insurance, as well as other parts of insurance that have to do with estate planning. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Daen so that he can give his presentation. We're glad to have him on this call, and I'll turn it over to you, Daen.
Thank you, Jeff. And I have to remote control the presentation, so if I ask for a slide change, please forgive me on that, as we had a little technical issue that prevented me from actually controlling the slides. So it's a pleasure to meet you all today. I'm from the UK. I now am a citizen of the United States or Texas, depending on who you ask. So don't hold that against me too much. And I'm going to talk about a problem that is fairly generic to most family offices and trusts, that a certain variation of financed insurance can be a very useful tool. I am one of those who do not believe that premium finance is the solution to all problems. What I do think is a very effective tool when used correctly, and it is our job to make the assessment about whether it's an applicable tool to use or not. So with a bit of luck, we'll get the presentation up. It doesn't look like we're there at the moment, so Let's just see what's going on there.
Bit of a technical issue.
Otherwise, I'll have to ad-lib it, which is always dangerous with me. So while we're waiting for that, rather than just have that lovely silence, let's talk about the generic problem as we see it. The old adage that generation one creates it, generation two builds it, and generation three destroys it is kind of a well-known adage. If we're looking at it from the point of view of a trust, the trust officers have a duty of care to look after the family assets and to try and satisfy the competing needs of all the beneficiaries. And one of the first cases that we were presented with was a situation where the original beneficiaries of the trust were 6 people. And there was about $50 million in the trust or something like that. Fast forward 3 or 4 generations, there were now, the trust officers have done a superb job. They got those assets up to about 480 million. The problem was there was 480 beneficiaries of the trust. So from a trust officer's perspective, with their duty of prudence, it's very difficult to see how you can invest the assets in a prudent manner and still have those assets grow at a sufficient pace so that you had sufficient assets to solve the next generation. So that's the basic issue that we're looking to solve. So let's look at the problem you have there. There's a portfolio of assets, and along comes somebody from the insurance industry and says, hello, let's take some of those assets to pay a premium to buy life insurance. And when the person passes away, the death benefit comes back to the trust. Great. The bit that's missing in all of that dialogue is that those assets are typically being used and churned by the family to keep each successive generation into the lifestyle they're accustomed to, or for whatever those distributions are being used for. So from a trust officer's perspective, forget any of the merits of life insurance or anything like that. If it was me in that position, I would simply be looking at, I've got an asset over here that's going to be liquid and going to give me a certain rate of return, versus this other asset called life insurance that's going to be illiquid and give me a certain rate of return, which is the best one. And they're competing arguments. But if you're starting to do forms of premium finance, we can eliminate that competition between the two asset classes and do both. Now, are we going to be able to get this PowerPoint up, or should I just continue going through? Do we know at this point? I'm calling out to tech support, but I don't know where tech support is. All right, so what we'll do is we'll just carry on with me talking. So just before we go into the mechanics of how we can do this, I would like to change your perspective, if I may, and ask you to all pretend that you are banking officers and that you're the credit department of a bank. So when we look at what does a bank want to do when they make a loan? First and foremost, they want to have a loan that's secured at all times. They don't want to be in a position that if a default occurs for whatever reason, they're not going to get their money back. What they really like is that the underlying thing that they're lending against as an asset grows in a way that doesn't just repay the loan, but achieves the client's objective as well. So in other words, the asset should grow at a faster rate than the loan, so you end up generating a surplus cash flow in some way, shape, or form. There we go. Fantastic. All right, so if we could just scroll down, I think we've just covered that one. Scroll one more slide. And so could we just scroll back up a second to that previous slide? Thank you. So let's look at a fact pattern that actually is real for Kodiak. they have a family trust. They're four beneficiaries, family beneficiaries of that trust. It's about $10 million worth of assets. So 2.5 million is available to this person called JAIME, who needs about $140,000 a year. If you run the maths as is illustrated here, and you can read faster than I can read it back out to you, the problem is that JAIME doing what she needs to do, that's in this particular fact pattern not even excessive in any particular way, that money will run out well within her lifetime. Now, we've had interesting situations where some of the family members seem to have some unrealistic needs. I mean, we've seen situations where people think it's logical to spend $450,000 on putting a pool in your backyard. But the issue is still the same one, which is JAIME doing what JAIME thinks is appropriate and right to do, with the expectation as a beneficiary of the trust being able to get these assets, is going to consume those assets. And it almost doesn't matter what the trust officer does unless they take excessive risk, which goes outside their remit and opens them up to liability. So next slide, please. So I mentioned this. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at is, now let's look at the banking view. The life policies that we're talking about using is a largely misunderstood product called an indexed universal life. The one thing I will tell you is it does not invest in a market index. The vast majority of cash posted as premium is secured into bonds with additional reserves posted by the carrier by regulatory requirements. So these are highly rated bonds. But more importantly, if you think about this interest rate environment, bond portfolios aren't as safe as people think they are, because in the event of a default where you had to liquidate those bonds, we probably have more mark-to-market risk than we've ever had. And so a bond portfolio that might be worth $10 million or whatever the number is could be worth $7 million if suddenly inflation becomes a problem and interest rates suddenly rise. Take those same bonds, put them inside a life insurance contract, such as a general account product would do, not in a variable product, but in a general account product. So it's whole life, universal life, index universal life. The mark-to-market risk is protected at all times. So whereas outside a life contract, these would have risk to a lender, i.e. their security may not be there when they need it. Put the same thing inside a life contract, suddenly they have some additional protections that makes it much more attractive from a lender point of view. But it actually goes a little bit further than that. As a general account product, in the event of a carrier default, that entire general account, each individual policy's cash values in the creditor perspective isn't really ring-fenced. So the billions and billions of dollars that sit inside these general accounts are available, and the lenders are senior secured against other creditors. So unless you had bond valuations dropping by over 90%, that I can't find a single incidence of where that's happened for high quality rated bonds, there is no way the banks are going to lose their money. Now, this is crucial to the plan that we're outlining, because it means that from a banking perspective, these policies represent some of the strongest and safest collateral you could possibly get. Next slide, please. Now let's look at whether this policy is going to grow at a faster rate than the loan without excessive risk being put on the table to do that. So if we look at LIBOR, LIBOR is just the base rate that banks are borrowing at, soon to be replaced by, well, there's a whole bunch of competing jargons. So I'll just collectively bundle them under the category of next ball. Because this is a really, really safe loan for banks, we can position that secured loans in this category can get very favorable pricing from banks. And so let's put LIBOR plus 175. It depends on the size of the transaction, but that's kind of the higher end of pricing rather than the lower end of pricing. So this is extremely easy to get pricing like this once we're dealing with banks who understand this. The problem that generically you would think about, though, is if you just click one more time, If we look at bond portfolios, you don't need to have done a lot of research to already know that borrowing a lot of money to invest in bonds, hoping the yield of that bonds is going to outpace a loan, there's not a lot of spread there, especially when we got good quality bonds. Statistically, there's about 25 basis points between the loan cost of LIBOR plus 175 and a bond portfolio. So there's not enough there unless you're dealing with squillions and squillions of dollars. There's not enough to generate any surplus. If you could click it one more time. A lot of wealthy clients use PPLI, or private placement life insurance, and that's basically a wrapper that they put all sorts of assets in. The problem with it from a banking point of view, nothing wrong with the product, from a banking point of view, it's the security. And so we run into some problems, either just the margin rules of a 50% discounting or stuff like that. In other words, the underlying riskiness of the valuation of the asset itself forces the lender to say, okay, this is not a safe asset, so I need further recourse through to the person. I either need personal guarantees, further assets, or I'm going to heavily compress it. But we also run into a 1933 or 34, I can't remember, Securities Act 11D violation where the SEC said, actually, we don't want you doing that. So that's the problem. So there's the spread, the risk return spread is there, but the actual financial dynamics, for want of a better phrase, aren't favorable. So if you could click one more time. Now, there's this product that's called an index universal life that has the vast majority of its base premium in bonds, but instead of giving you bond returns, it tracks an index. It's not invested in the index, but it tracks change per year in an index. Any year the index is negative, it simply records a zero. Your principal is protected at all times. So from a banking point of view, it's pretty simple for us to say, well, if my principal is protected, let me take all the contract costs out, and I know my liquidation value at any moment in time. I have zero probability of not getting that money back. When the market is up, however, what happens is the growth is based on a long option. The amount of option that you can buy, or how much of the upside you can buy, is dependent on the bond yield, so it's interest rate sensitive. But on average, it will give you 2% more than the fixed income general account product or bond portfolio. So if you're outside of the insurance world, you'd call it a glorified bond portfolio. If you're inside the insurance world, you'd call it a universal life or a whole life product. They've got some slight differences, but essentially they're fixed income assets. The risk return is about another 2%. So we have about a 4% spread between LIBOR and the average performance of this product. If you could click one more time, please. So the question we asked ourselves was, how consistent is that risk spread? Well, if you're tracking something like the S&P, your guess is as good as mine about whether the S&P will be up or down. There's so many factors that makes it very difficult to predict. But if we go back and test the spread between S&P and bond returns, as an example, the more time we have, and all of you would know this, the more time we have, the more likely it is the S&P is going to outperform bonds. However, the S&P has the full market up and down speculative risk, the volatility as people would call it. If we have a structure that has downside limitations, so every time the market's negative, you ignore it, you just have a zero. And every time the market's up, you get some of that up. The more higher interest rates, the more up you get, but statistically, you're going to average 80% of the upside. And one thing I forgot to mention is every policy year there's growth, that growth is reinvested in the bonds and locked in. So once you've got to your high point, you're resetting your principal protection at the high point. So it will not go down outside of contract costs. So our job is obviously to minimize contract costs. But because we've got a very, very safe loan from a bank point of view, they're secured against these bonds, but the growth profile is going to be about 225 basis points above the cost of the loan. Over time, what we found when we had the actuaries run the numbers, that over a 15-year period, this becomes over 99% probable. So what we then say is, let's make sure we stress test for the storms that occur within 15 years. And the analogy I always say is, look, Florida is lovely in the summer. It's nice, it's warm, it averages about 94 degrees. The bit that's missed out in that average is every now and again a hurricane comes in, and that's not terribly pleasant to experience. But if we stress test for these black swan events, which I'll show you later, we can mitigate the risk. Next slide, please. So the other thing that most people don't think about life insurance, and this is just a spreadsheet, but I'll point out the key points here, is that there's this tendency to assume that's great, but we're waiting for people to die. Now, if we tune the policy design around cash accumulation versus death benefit, actually we can start to create living income flows, cash stream as we would call it. And what we basically do is at a future date and time, we pay off the bank loan when the cash value is sufficiently surplus because of the spreads I mentioned in the previous slide. But people like Kodiak Trust can drop the death benefit and take policy loans out of the policy. And because of the tax advantages that life insurance enjoys, those policy loans are tax advantages. You don't pay tax on a loan. And that loan is repaid out of death benefit at a later date if we design these the way we do when the person dies. So you don't actually have to pay back the loan from assets within the family trust. And in this particular example, you can see there's a family that they bundled together numbers where it's about $110 million worth of death benefit. And if you look at the premium schedule over on the left-hand side, 2.7 million is an awful lot of money to put into a policy. And what we're really doing there is we're putting more money than we need to cover costs. The maximum amount we're allowed to put in more than that to build up this surplus. And that's the money we're interested in, the surplus over and above that's needed to cover costs. But because of the security of the loan, so we've got the loan pricing down there, that's basically a forward curve with the spread put on it at the time we ran this. What happens in this, we use the policy's cash surplus as the primary security of the loan. And once that builds up sufficiently, that becomes the sole security. The banks that we work with are acutely aware of this policy's features, and so they're comfortable capitalizing or rolling the interest within the design. So we're not borrowing a lot of money that has a lot of interest payments on it. We have a lot of money borrowed where it's capitalized within the loan. So it's a balloon loan. So what we then do is we say, okay, let's discount the cash value to its worst performance it can occur within a year. We know that the worst it can do in a year is 0. So for any year, we'll just ignore any growth in the illustration and we'll just discount it to its minimum liquidation value for that year. When it gets a credit at the end of the year, we'll take that into account. But until that, we're going to ignore it completely. This is a big mistake a lot of premium finance groups do, is they kind of assume a bank is going to take speculative views on the cash value of the policy. They're not. This is a secure loan. We can then post some outside collateral. I'll come to how we're going to do that. We post the outside collateral to cover any shortfall until the cash values build up to greater than this discounted value. So the key point about this particular slide, other than a bunch of numbers, is we can borrow money, secure it against a super safe asset class as far as the bank's concerned. That asset has a highly predictable outcome if we give it time. We show the stress test column there, the third from the right there, to show what are extreme black swans. Now, what we do in black swans is like Great Depressions, 1980s interest rates. I mean, extreme black swans, and we'll use that for a slide I'll show you in a second. But we're not going to wait for people to die. So one of the things that came up with family offices is, we don't want to be in a position that, somebody wants somebody else to die quickly. These people could live forever as far as we're concerned within this design, or we would term it as mortality neutral. But the key thing here is that if we assign assets, as long as there's no opportunity cost to assign that asset, the direct cost to the family office is removed. In other words, we're no longer saying, hey, take this working asset over here, liquidate it and use it to pay for a life insurance premium or to make an interest payment, which is a competing friction point. Here we're instead saying, is there a class of assets within the family office that we can just assign? All the growth is still with the family office, all the investment is still with the family office, the return and so on. We're just assigning it to secure a loan until we don't need it anymore. Next slide, please. Right, so let's look at a typical setup. So we have a family office, and you'll notice that we've carved a little, I guess I'm slightly colorblind, so this is dangerous for me, a dark blue or black box, and I called it FI, standing for fixed income. So this would be the portion of the family office portfolio that, for prudence purposes, is sitting in some sort of fixed income asset. Now, what do we know about fixed income right now? No yield, and I mentioned that there's some issues on whether it's actually providing any protection. But from the trust asset breakdowns that I've been seeing from the ones we've looked at recently, there's about 20-25% sitting in some sort of fixed income. There's always a conservative skew here. Now, what happens with that fixed income? Essentially, it's held until maturity, and then new fixed income is purchased. So what we typically do when we're talking with the trust officer is say, what portion of that asset class are you willing to carve out, because you're essentially just holding it and renewing it if it matures like a fixed income asset. And let's decide what portion of that we're comfortable using as collateral. And what we're interested here is the conversation that focuses on that stress test column, because we don't want the stress test collateral to ever be above the amount the family office was willing to post and able to post as collateral. Now, if it's something like fixed income bonds and they're just going to hold to maturity, there's zero opportunity cost here for them to hold those, assign a portion as necessary, and keep the return and yield such as it is in this interest rate environment. So the collateral is pretty easy to isolate when you have this kind of fact pattern. However, we do not want the debt directly with the family office or trust. So we set up an ILET that is the owner and the beneficiary of these policies, and it is the borrower. That way we can limit any recourse here to purely the collateral shortfall. So the vast majority of the credit risk here is the cash value of the life insurance policy, which in turn is backed by the credit rating of the carrier. So we're really shifting the vast majority of credit risk or loan risk over to the life insurance carrier, not the family office. And what we do from an administrative point of view is we work out the maximum collateral for any 12-month forward period. So we always have a bracketing of what our risk parameters look like. It will never go above what we want it to go within that period. So the life insurance carrier assigns its policy to the lender. The shortfall is made up by family office fixed income assets or something like that. When we start pulling income out, the sole beneficiary of this ILET is the family office. So any proceeds from either a premature death, most would say every death is premature, but let's bear with me on that, or more valuable from a reputational point of view is the fact that we hope nobody ever dies. Younger members can participate who will live a long time, and we'll take these policy loans that would just rejuvenate or bring additional cash flow into the family office, so that as the beneficiaries multiply generation after generation, we have a way of sustaining that by essentially boosting the yield on the fixed income assets. I mean, that's really what's going on here. Next slide, please. I think we've covered that, so let's just move on to the next slide. Right, this is slightly blurred, so apologies for this. So let's go back to the JAIME scenario where we looked at some of the assets there, because that either my eyesight's fading or that's rather blurred. So let's look at what was really going on. We expected to need for this transaction about $300,000 worth of collateral. But the stress test said around 980. So that's what we were modeling to. Can the trust post 980? But we could generate from year 21 onwards about $130,000. Is that right? I can't quite read that. 106,000 it looks like, of income per year. And that was discounting down what software actually told us we could do. So we were discounting back just to be conservative. And that's tax-free income. So as before on the example, she was having to pull out 200,000 to have 140 net of tax. Here we've got 106,000 in this example to supplement. So this would generate about a $13 million, if assuming she lived to age 100, about $13 million of tax-free income. But because we were backing off the numbers we could pull out of the policy, there was still net $17 million worth of death benefit if and when she should pass away at around age 100. So if you think about it from the trust's point of view, not only has that cut down the 200,000 that would otherwise have to come out, in fact, coming in just around when the trust would have been exhausted, actually, otherwise, it also gives $17 million or whatever the death benefit is at the time she passes away for the next generation. Next slide, please. So let's summarize what we've just covered here. Premium financing here can be used for all sorts of different things, but essentially we've got a situation. Oh, I'm sorry, I was off on the projected income. Next slide down. Forgive my poor eyesight. It was actually 305,000, so way more than sufficient to cover the ongoing needs of JAIME in this example. Because it's tax-free from the policy, because it's a policy loan, we're hedging against the potential risk of future tax increases, which I think most of us would say sometime within the next 20 years, taxes are likely to be higher than they are today. And we got that residual death benefit, but it was all secured against a fixed income position that was no opportunity cost to the family. So that friction point within the family trust of do I do this asset or that asset is eliminated in this. So unless we can allocate, some of the conversations we had was show me the IRR, and I said, well, unless we can allocate a cost, we can't compute an IRR. It's just giving incremental additional return to what otherwise within fixed income. There really isn't a lot of income coming from fixed income right now. Next slide, please. So from our perspective, we then said, okay, well, now let's look at the fact that this isn't really just JAIME. There are 3 other siblings. What would happen if they all took this approach? Because although JAIME's needs were different, the problem was universal to all the family members, that either in this generation or next, it's highly likely that family asset base is diluted to nothing. So we then replicated this across all 4 siblings of generation 2. You can see the numbers there, somewhere around 1.2 million of expected collateral with a stress position. As long as the collateral assets were below 4 million, the family trust would, quite often the size of the case would be dictated by what that collateral base is. If they only had 2, we would scale it back. If they wanted to do more, so on and so forth. But we could generate a total of 1.2 projected based on the assumptions we used, which was about a 6% return, if I recall, which is about the average for my policy. I've got a couple of these on myself. It's perhaps unfair because it's a little bit higher than that. But the average that most of the carriers talk about is about 7.5% return on these assets since inception. So that's below the historical performance of these products. But we generate about 1.2 million tax-free revenue for a total of $52 million of tax-free revenue, and still leaving a residual death benefit depending on when each member passes away of between a total of $24 to $60 million worth of death benefit, again tax-free. And that death benefit incorporates repaying back to the carrier all the policy allowance. So this is a net number. So next slide, please. So what have we really done? We've used a different version of financing of insurance, that one that we fortunately specialize in, that focuses on a quintessential problem that's actually quite tough to fix, just because the other assets in the trust don't lend themselves to this kind of leveraging or tax advantages. So it's a very elegant solution for that particular fact pattern, with the caveat is that we always want to stay within that ring fencing of collateral range that we identified through both regular and stress testing, so that we know we're well within the parameters. And so I was talking to a family office probably about 4 or 5 months ago, where very much bigger than this. They had something like $500 million, but they had $80 million sitting in bonds. And they were willing to allocate $40 million towards this collateral pool. And so all our stress testing had to stay within $40 million, even though we knew they were going to get 2 or 3% yield on those bonds over time. and then we can factor that into the equation. We stay below 40. So that's a key element of the design when we're having that kind of conversation. Next slide, please. So I've used up my time. Hopefully this was a different perspective for you to think about that was involving life insurance but didn't involve people dying. With that, I'll post any or respond to any questions that you may have about this particular approach. And I can't see the questions, so I'm going to ask Jeff or one of his team to look at those, if you wouldn't mind, please, Jeff.
Yeah, one of the questions that I had is obviously we are looking at a raising tax environment, and a major benefit to insurance policies is that there isn't any tax on that. Are you foreseeing any changes in that?
Yeah, so one of the questions that frequently comes up is, will the tax advantages of life insurance continue? And you have to remember there's over 150 million people in this country that have life insurance contracts. So if there's tax advantages which were attacked, I would say that's probably not a vote winning argument, right? So I think it's as likely as now. I can say this as a Brit. I couldn't say this as or somebody who originally was Brit. That's about as likely as having complete gun repeal in the United States, right? I mean, some people might advocate for it, but it's not going to happen. Having said all that, you could never say there will never be anything happening, right? But if you look at it already, 401ks have been on the docket multiple times. So a lot of other tax advantage entities would be attacked prior to life insurance, I would argue. Can't ever say for certain, but I think it's a very, very low probability event. Now, for plans that are already in place, almost always, so we look at the tax changes that have occurred in life insurance through the last 100 years or so, every single one of those grandfathers existing plans in place.
Okay. Another question. What happens if the beneficial owner goes bankrupt at year 7 and cannot maintain the collateral?
Yeah, so the risk of any financing transaction is and actually it's a really good question, because in our experience, we have not, touch wood, had a design failure yet, but we have had clients lose their net worth. And when we find that situation, so for example, in the banking crisis of 2008-9, we had 3 or 4 clients who went from 40, 50 million down to 10 million or whatever the result was. It was not a good day for them. So we did controlled shutdowns. And when we have a controlled shutdown, we work with the banks. Obviously, the banks are very keen not to have default positions. And you may lose some or all of that collateral if you had. I mean, that's the primary risk of this transaction, which is why I said we always want to carve out a subsection of the assets. We never want to be in a position where 80% of the family trust assets were assigned. I mean, that's way too much risk for us to want to take on, and I'm sure for the trustee to ever consider. So we always want to build it into a stress condition, because I will tell you the banking crisis was nothing, not even close to the 80s or the Great Depression from a stress position. But if they ultimately lost all their net worth, which would take some pretty interesting activity. I won't say it would be the trust officer who did this, but some interesting reckless behavior on behalf of the family, then ultimately you could create a default and some or all of that collateral. Now, I won't say all, because the bank discounts the collateral, so some of that collateral would be lost.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? We had those come up. I don't think so, Daen. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
If any of you are interested in speaking with Daen at NIW, I'm sure he'd be willing to talk to you, or we can work together.
Yeah,
we can work together.
It's actually easier for me, Jeff, if they actually contact Kodiak, because for us to be able to design a solution around this, we really need to know the family fact pattern that we're operating within. As I said, this is really just a tool that fits within a greater plan. So I always think of it as a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, not the jigsaw puzzle. So what is necessary for us to, I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions about the basic design logic, but to do an actual case, we need to work very closely with the trust to know what the available asset base is, what the need is, and so on, so that we make sure we keep our collateral within those parameters I outlined.
Another question did come in. Can we increase the death benefit as the years go by?
So yes and no. And so let me explain what's going on here. The product we're using is called an increasing death benefit product anyway. So it does actually go up as the cash grows. But we're funding it to the absolute maximum we're allowed without creating what the industry would call a MEC, or a modified endowment contract, which is a taxable event. So if you want to increase the amount of death benefit, normally what would happen is you get an additional policy. So for example, as additional family members come in, you would add them to the pie. As if we started off conservative, we said, okay, now we feel very comfortable, we want to do another one, we typically get a second policy on top of that. There's some tax rules we have to be very careful with on this. Now, the tax rules on this MEC issue just changed, so we actually can get quite a lot more money into policies than we used to. But as a general rule, we try to make them as efficient as possible. So let's step back a second and think about that. For any given death benefit, there's going to be a series of charges to cover the cost of insurance and so on. The more money we put into that policy, the more we're diluting that charge down to, I put it analogous to an ATM, where you go to an ATM, the $2 charge at the ATM is quite a lot of money if you pull out $10. But if you pull out $400 or $4,000, it becomes progressively less of a cost. That's what we're doing inside the design. So we try to make each design as efficient as we can. It minimizes the charge structure within it. So in answer to your question, if it's outside the parameters of where the death benefit's growing anyway, we would typically put a second policy. And you can certainly, as long as you can justify the coverage. I mean, if you get some of these really wealthy families where you might be more than able to put 150 million per child, certainly some of the families that Kodiak has as families, they can justify 50, 60, $100 million worth of coverage. Then you start to use up the capacity. But providing you haven't used the capacity, yes, you can add more to it, but not within the policy per se, outside of what I've just said.
Very good. That popped.
Okay, so have I answered all the questions that have popped up at this time, Jeffrey?
We have, and we appreciate your time and your knowledge. We definitely enjoy working with you on the insurance policies that we've been working on before, and offer that service, as you said, to work with Kodiak Trust Company and with NIW to fulfill any premium financing needs. And Daen, thank you very much for being here today.
My pleasure, and I hope it was worth your while and found it interesting, despite my technical screw-ups that were repeated in many, but I apologize for that. Thank you so much.
No, that was our fault. We're glad to have you, and thanks all for attending. Look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Thank you very much.